Good evening. My name is Sanders A.B, class 1994, co-chair of Duke Black Alumni. It is my great honor to welcome you to the first ever collaboration between Duke Black Alumni and the Duke LGBTQ Network for an event entitled Black and LGBTQ at Duke, A Journey in Resilience and Progress. This collaboration is long overdue and is one of the first of many conversations exploring the intersection of Black and queer culture, history, and identity at Duke and beyond. This event is personal to me, as I have evolved greatly as a straight ally from my time at Duke over 30 years ago in the 1990s. My good friend Tim West, who you'll hear from in a second, was my first true openly gay friend. And while I was never hostile to the community, I didn't exactly embrace the community or individuals being their whole selves until well after college. And for that, I am profoundly embarrassed and truly sorry. As we've seen from the racial justice protests over the summer, it is no longer acceptable to sit on the sidelines. Just like Duke is seeking to become an anti-racist institution, it is incumbent upon all of us to expressly oppose any phobia, hate, bias, or violence against our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. And more than that, actively support, celebrate, and affirm them and their whole identities. Clearly at Duke and in society, we still have much work to do. The racist letter to the editor that appeared in the Winter Duke magazine a few months ago demonstrates that even among our own alumni base, ignorance and bias still exists. We must confront these isms head on. We are pleased, however, this event is taking place during Black History Month. Black LGBTQ history is Black history and is American history. From Bayard Rustin organizing the March on Washington, to the fierce writings of James Baldwin, to modern times where two of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement identify as lesbian, LGBTQ leaders have always stood at the forefront of the Black community, but have not always been given their due recognition and respect, and that must change. We hope that tonight's conversation opens some eyes to the remaining challenges, but also the resilience and joy of the Black LGBTQ experience at Duke, in America, in the African diaspora, and throughout the world. And with that, I'm pleased to turn over the mic to my good friend and brother, Tim West.
Thank you so much, Sanders. I am selfishly and sort of pleased to be introduced by you, my fellow 94 classmate. It's definitely a long road and journey, even myself as someone that identifies as a part of the community. And I'm quite often described as a fearless leader of the Black Student Alliance at the time, who certainly did a lot of work with the then Duke Gay and Lesbian Association. We've certainly evolved in terms of the acronyms that we use. But a lot of people who know me as that fearless leader don't know that I'm a Black male that walked around the Bryan Center 4 times before going to see a Marlon Riggs screening. Some of you may not know of some of the difficult and anxious filled conversations before Blue Jeans Day, which some of you may remember. It was a day that people would don blue jeans to indicate that they were part of the LGBT community. And for some of us who were really anxious about making that decision and the stand that it would represent, those were all-nighters and not studying, just all-nighters around trying to pep talk yourself into being bold and proud and visible. And so, you know, I'm here today alongside Sanders and alongside so many other people because we all are concerned about creating a community at Duke and an alumni network at Duke that is an exemplar of what it means to be inclusive, of what it means to practice and live and be mindful about intersectionality, so that people are not in a space where they're having to make decisions around how they will show up as Black or as LGBTQ, but can show up as both. And I would like to think Duke is a much better place when we can see that Black trans women at our school, Black trans alumni, Black non-binary people feel proud and affirmed and loved by the university that they've given so much to as well. And so with that, because I'll be on the panel and say a lot more, I want to actually introduce one of my colleagues. For those of you who are not aware, there is an LGBTQ network, and you're certainly welcome to join that. I think there'll be some links added so that people can find out how to join it. And that has been a network that has also been pushed around its inclusiveness around gender, around race, but certainly one of the inaugural board members that I got a chance to know somewhat is someone that's going to present a project that they did at Duke around queering Duke history. And that is someone who is a part of our Black community as well. So I'm going to transition and turn it over to Denzell Faison.
Thank you so much, Tim for that introduction. As Tim said, my name is Denzell Faison, and I am a 2014 graduate of Duke University. I was a history major when I was there. And part of my, during part of my time at Duke, I engaged on a project along with a lot of others to understand some of the history, the queer history at Duke and in Durham. And so I'm going to share a little bit of that project with you all. There was an exhibit in the Perkins Library in 2014. So many of you who live in Durham maybe were able to see it. But if not, some of this information might be new and some of it won't be so new. But just to give you an overview of the history and why this project came about, Tim talked about the difficulty of being both Black and LGBT, right? Particularly in a school like ours. And that came to particular head for me when I was the co-president of Blue Devils United. And it was the time when the West Union building was being renovated. And so the LGBT Center was going to have to be moved, along with the Mary Lou Center and some of the other offices in that building. And the administration entered into a dialogue with the leaders of each group about where we wanted our space to be, what vision we had going forward. And it was in a meeting with someone from the administration that Jacob Deberry and I, who were the co-presidents at the time, were told that the Black Student Association would get first pick on location, and the LGBT students would have to pick after the Black Student Association picked. And so here I am in this office, both Black and gay, but as the president of the LGBT student organization, trying to figure out how I can do the best job to get the most space and the best location for my organization. And when we asked why this was, why Black students were getting first pick over the LGBT students, we were told it was because Duke had a history of systematically discriminating against Black students. And it had no such history of doing the same thing with gay students. And as you can imagine, I knew that didn't sound quite right of being a Methodist school in the South, but we had no evidence of that. So thus started the project. And so this is a little bit of what we found. So the project really started in the 1960s. And what I did when I first looked at this was I divided each decade into what I called ages. And so this one was called the age of arrest. But as you'll see, every age is met with setbacks and advances, with the one exception probably being the 1960s, which is all setbacks, unfortunately. The only records we have of LGBT activity on campus are the arrest of 64, which were all gay men during the 1960s by the Duke Security Division, which was a precursor to the Duke Police Force. And they were arrested for homosexuality, and these 64 individuals were all expelled from the university. Now, during the project, I also had a chance to interview with a few of them. One in particular, who I remember he told me, he said, failing out of Duke is one thing, but to go home gay was unacceptable. But that's what he had to do, because the university had this policy that was actually in tandem with the FBI to make sure that they found any LGBT activity on campus, have it reported, and those individuals were removed from the university. Moving up through the 1970s, the age of coming out, and this is when we really start to see a lot of activity on campus. There are various student groups, and you'll notice that there are many different names. One of the first groups is the Duke Gay Alliance, and we had the Gothic Queers, we have Bulldogs United. So there are a lot of different names that the group goes by, but one of the first ones was in the early 1970s. And we also had a queer publication too, called the Gay Morning Star. One interesting point to also note here is that President Sanford, who we all know as being one of the leaders in the forefronts of racial justice, both in North Carolina and throughout the South, was actually quite progressive on LGBT issues. And when the student group requested that he add sexual orientation to the non-discrimination code, he said that he didn't think it was appropriate to put homosexuals and ethnic minorities and women into the same category, because being gay was a choice and the other ones weren't. So you kind of see where we were at that time. When we move through the 1980s, we see what happens on campus closely mirrors in a lot of ways what's happening in the country at that time, right? So we have the AIDS epidemic, we have Reagan revolution, and it's a lot more closed off than it was in terms of what we saw in the 1970s. Two examples of this is that the student government actually removed the charter for the Duke Gay and Lesbian Alliance once in 1983 and then again in 1985. This was because they were afraid that it would run afoul of the state and local laws against, quote unquote, promoting homosexuality. And we see that, as I said before, not everything was bad during this time, right? We had Harry Britt, who I don't know if many of you knew, was a Duke grad, class of 1960, and is a supervisor who took over for Harvey Milk after his assassination. He spoke on campus during the 1980s, which was a pretty fun thing to learn as well. Then we get into the 1990s, which is some of what Tim spoke about in his time here. Shout out to him also for being the first openly gay president of the Black Student Association. And I'm sure he'll talk more about that and kind of the balance that he saw there. But the 90s is really when we start to see a big push and turnaround in a lot of areas for LGBT equality. And this really coincides a lot with President Brody's term. He was pretty progressive during some of the oral histories that we did. I got to speak with him. And he actually had been, through his psychology degree and study, had been studying gay issues since the 1970s. So he was not new to the issue at all. He leads the formation of the LGBT task force. The LGB Center, notice the missing T here, is established. And the university actually extends university benefits to same-sex couples. Now getting into the 21st century, if you notice at the last slide, it mentioned that in 1999, Duke was actually ranked by the Princeton Review as one of the most homophobic universities in the United States. And it again receives that distinction in 2002, which just shows you, even with all of the progress that was happening, it was still a very difficult time for people on campus. But then again, here in the 2000s, there are a lot of great strides that are made, especially in terms of visibility. The Blue Jeans Day was mentioned before. That was something really from the 90s, but here we have moving through the Love Equals Love t-shirts, which anyone who's been on campus in the last 2 decades, I'm sure has seen many of them. They're very popular. The first celebration of Coming Out Day was celebrated in 2007. And the center actually gets a T here, you'll notice, and it moves to a bigger space at the basement of the West Union building, which is where it was when I was a student there for the first part of my time. And moving into, which was my time at Duke, the 2010s, we really see more of a focus on trans issues, which we hadn't really seen a lot before. And 2 of the big policy changes that happened during the last decade was allowing students to use their preferred name on class rosters, which was a big change. And Duke also pretty much led the way in gender neutral housing, which was pretty exciting as well. And I remember that when I was a student there. We had the battle against Amendment 1, which was in 2012. So for those of you that remember, Amendment 1 was the amendment that that made the definition of marriage only between 1 man and 1 woman in the state of North Carolina. It was a pretty tough fight. The campus really engaged in it. And if you look at the map of that time, you'll see there are a few blue dots across a red map, and that's pretty much Durham, Chapel Hill, and some of the other university towns in the mountains area. But that was kind of what we were up against. And when I presented this project originally in 2014, this was before the Supreme Court had heard the Obergefell case, right? So same-sex marriage was still not the law of the land. But right before I left, the university was able to decide on the space issue that brought us to this whole project to begin with. And the center was moved from the basement to the Bryan Center. So if anybody's seen it, it's a great glass building. You can look right into it. And it's right on the top floor of the Bryan Center, which is, a big change from being in the basement as it was before. And so this is really the crux for me of why I originally engaged on this project. To come back to that, which was because I was put in a position of having to advocate against one of my identities, and one of them was explicitly pit against the other one. Right, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that when we open up for the panel discussion. But it was probably the most explicit that I was ever forced to choose, the type of question of whose side are you on type of question. And for the university to say that we've never discriminated against LGBT students and to just miss that history out, really, it fueled me and it fueled a lot of other people at the time to really find this history and make sure that it was remembered, because the university was making current decisions back in 2013 based on their understanding of what happened in the past. And as we saw, that understanding was flawed. And so we were able to present this history to President Broadhead, who was president at the time, along with 11 demands, we called them. And we had a task force set up, and we made a lot of great strides when I was there, and the students after me kept that going. It is interesting to note that we created 11 demands, but we didn't realize that after that 11 was actually also the number of demands that the Black students used when they took over the Allen building in 1969. So it's funny how things come around. And many of our demands were quite similar in terms of study, in terms of course of study. They wanted more Black studies. We wanted more LGBT studies, in terms of resources and funding. So it just shows you how interconnected these communities really are from the beginning. And I would be remiss if I didn't say thanks to so many people who helped in this project back when I first did it, particularly Dr. Janie Long and Dr. Raymond Gavins, who were my co-advisors to the project. Janie, as you know, used to be the director of LGBT Center and worked in the Student Affairs Office for many years. And Professor Gavins was my advisor and was also the second Black faculty member at Duke. And so I was truly privileged and honored to be able to work with him and take this course and have him come on and advise me on this project. and get to learn from him and spend some time with him before he unfortunately passed a couple years ago now. So I hope that gives you a quick rundown of kind of what my project looked at. Sorry, I had to be so quick. Where I tried to cover, was that 60 years in about 10, 15 minutes, but this by no means is the full history of LGBT life at Duke. It was kind of a snapshot of some of the things I found, and for the explicit purpose of what I was using it for, right, which was to get action at the university at the time. So I would encourage anyone who's still on campus, whether you're teaching or connected in any way, to keep this project up. And we've had 7 years since the end of mine, and I know a lot of great work has happened since then. So I would love to hear what's happening now. And I'll pass it off to Professor DeFranz for him to open up the panel.
And team, before we move to the panel discussion, this is Sanders. I neglected to mention that we will have a Q&A portion at the end. So there should be a Q&A tab on your screens. Please populate that with questions, comments for the panel, and we will get to those at the end. So thank you very much. Now, Professor DeFranz.
Yes, here I am. And hi, I'm Professor DeFranz. I'm broadcasting from the Slippage Laboratory, which is in the very fancy new Rubenstein Arts Center. We tend to acknowledge that these lands where the Rubenstein and a lot of Duke has been built are the ancestral lands of the Shakori, the Tuscarora, and the Eno tribes. And I'm really happy to be here as a current faculty member at Duke, who is affiliated with gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, African-American studies, and dance. And it's my privilege to be able to talk to a group of amazing alums and current students who want to tell stories of our resilience here, working on the campus of Duke, or our remembrances of what queer Black life has been at Duke. I've been at Duke for about 10 years. I came down here to bring my research group Slippage here. And Slippage is a performance research group that explores alternative histories. We tend to make projects about histories that we think we can use. And these tend to be projects of Black queer life throughout the kind of work that we do. I've been happily a Black queer person since my grandmother outed me to my family in Indianapolis, Indiana, when I think I was 13, and she announced to our family that I was queer. And it kind of stuck because she was our grandmother and she was telling everyone things that I didn't even quite know about myself. But it was super helpful for me in terms of my family and my own sort of personal development, because it let me grow into my extravagant abundances, if you will, as a queer person of color, and then as an academic and an artist. So we want to hear stories from people about how they remember their time here, how they're thinking of it now, what kinds of things they hope to get moving in terms of what's happening on the campus, and super appreciative of Denzell's work to bring those stories forward. Right now on campus, I'm teaching a course, Black Queer, which is a graduate seminar. It has 6 students in it. I teach general courses, Intro to African-American Studies. In those courses, we spend an awful lot of time paying attention to our queer kinfolk because they are foundational and they're also of urgent importance and interest to me. I've enjoyed working with many queer kids of color, queer students of color in my time here at Duke. So I think my experience is super different in some ways than many of our panelists tonight. And at the same time, there's just so far to go. And I'm sure we're going to hear that as we work through the panelists and the stories they want to tell us. Well, we're going to get started with Satana Deberry, and I'm really happy to invite Satana to join into the panel now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor DeFranz. I'm excited to be here. I want to take a point of personal privilege to say thank you to both Sanders and Tim M. Our times at Duke overlapped. Sanders was a friend of mine when he was here. And I think probably about 15 years ago, I sent Tim M an email that said when I was in the law school, Tim M was in probably the Chronicle every other day, causing some kind of good trouble. And I think he even went to Howard and dragged everybody at Howard out of the closet during his undergraduate years. And so I sent him an email really acknowledging the role that he had had in my life during that time. I was in law school at Duke in the early 90s, early to mid 90s. I came straight from college, I did my undergraduate work at Princeton. And if you were, kind of at the Black Ivies at the Ivies, if you were Black at the Ivies in the late 80s and early 90s, all you ever heard about was how much fun Duke and Stanford were for the Black students. And so I got here and found that it was great to be a Black undergrad, not so great to be a Black grad student. Certainly not so great to be a young Black adult with sexual orientation issues starting to emerge. I think for me, the big story of my coming out is that I had spent so much time focused on being a successful student that I didn't think about anything else. And that at some point, you have accomplished what you set out to accomplish. And then you have to think about, well, who am I? And what do I want for the rest of my life? And so that was kind of my story of being here at Duke. And I am currently the elected district attorney here in Durham County. So I've been here in Durham for most of my adult life. And it is an interesting place to be both Black and queer. Durham has about 100 years of Black political power. Everyone's heard of Black Wall Street and knows the story of Black Durham. Durham also has an equally strong queer history, although that is mostly white. And generally, those worlds are at odds, as Denzell said. And I think though they are uneasy allies in this community. And so I'm gonna stop there. I think I'm at my 5 minutes, Professor DeFrance, and let you introduce the next person.
Oh, you're amazing. But no, I want to dial us back briefly for just 1 second, if you don't mind. I just wonder if you could say a little more, like remembering back from Princeton to Duke. So you reminded us we're in this Black Ivies kind of constellation, which is true. I mean, we talk about that in different circles, but were there differences in how you were understanding Black students, and even as you were figuring out what you were up to at Princeton? Like, what do you remember about the differences of moving down to Durham from Princeton in that transition?
I think the thing that I remember most is Duke is actually the place that people think Princeton is. I found Duke to be
Whoa.
I found Duke to be a lot more elitist than Princeton was. There are more, we used to joke that I met more people from New Jersey at Duke than I met in college at Princeton. And I just think some of that was, Duke is a much larger school. And, Princeton, at least during the time that I was there and the time since, has made a concentrated effort to diversify its student body around class. I am, a native North Carolinian raised in rural North Carolina. I am the unlikeliest Princeton undergraduate ever. So just my presence there as an undergrad, I think speaks to what they were trying to do.
Thank you so much, Satana. Thank you for participating. We're going to turn to Mikael Owunna and hear some stories about a different era in Duke's history. Let's see, there you are, Mikael. I see you there. Okay. Thank you so much, Mikael.
Thank you. And thank you again, everybody, for this amazing opportunity. I think it's such an important conversation that we're having tonight. And so really just a big thank you to everybody for participating and for the D.B.A. and the LGBT network for co-hosting this event tonight. My name is Mikael Owunna. I am Duke class of 2012. So from that last decade that was discussed in Denzell's presentation. I double majored in biomedical engineering and history. And in terms of my experience at Duke, so my background is I'm Nigerian and Swedish, grew up in the United States in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And my freshman year at Duke, I'd actually been outed previously in high school, and my family would go back to Nigeria every Christmas. And during my freshman Christmas at Duke, we went back to our village, and I was actually put through a series of exorcisms due to my sexuality. And that moment kind of really catalyzed a whole series of transformations for me. And I think this is one of the ways in which the experiences of Black LGBT students at Duke are just so different and really need a specific lens given to our experiences. Because when I came back to the campus after that really traumatizing event, there weren't specific spaces set aside for Black LGBT students. There wasn't a specific Black LGBT student center. There may have been coursework. I wasn't necessarily aware of what coursework may have been available at the time. And so I felt really isolated actually during my Duke experience, and so I think over the course of college, I had to really try to kind of craft spaces for myself, and art really became my outlet that allowed me to find spaces of belonging that I didn't feel that institutionally were necessarily supported there. And so yeah, I think, again, just really want to, again, thank everybody for being here, but really want to kind of push on the need for us to kind of specifically uplift for current students, kind of the coursework like Professor DeFrance is working on in terms of Black queer experiences, and also really specifically funding, Black LGBT groups, mental health, coursework, everything to really provide, a really full-bodied experience for our students.
Mikael, thank you so much. That's super helpful. And, sometimes people just don't really know how we go through our lives. And there's so many different ways, but, to hear your stories of what happened to you in terms of family and kin and finding your way back into what you needed to be able to finish your education at Duke and move on into your life. This feeling of isolation, and you're pointing towards like a need for sort of places for us to gather. We're gathering for the first time, the 10 of us, virtually in public in front of 325 people. But it'd be nice for us to gather in other ways outside of these kinds of public events. So what do you remember about your time? Was there anything that allowed you to do that? Maybe even as a mixed race or Black student, and however you want to identify there. Like, where were the places that you did feel like you could gather that didn't make space for queer necessarily?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think there were informal spaces that were created by like Black LGBT students at Duke. So there were some kind of like informal groupings and gatherings of small groups of friends. And so I think that's one of the ways in which community is created, and when we kind of create community for ourselves. And so I think that was one of the spaces. It wasn't necessarily institutionally supported, but we still found ways to connect with each other. So I think that's one of the tools that we've come to use.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure that that's still very much in operation now. We'll hear from our current student later. But yeah, this idea that there need to be both formal and informal spaces. I guess that's what I would say back in a way that we need all of it. It's not enough to just have the informal spaces, as you're suggesting. We also need some formal spaces that allow folks to stretch and bend. Well, thank you so much, Mikael. We're going to move now to hear some reflections from Lee Levingston Perine. And Lee, let me take a minute here to find you. So there you are. Okay, terrific. Welcome.
Thank you. So I'm Lee Levingston Perine. My pronouns are he, him. Again, I'm really excited to be here, and thank you for this opportunity. Before I go any further, I have to say hi, Mom. Thanks for tuning in from Memphis. I love you. And so I'm the founder of an arts collective called Makers Lab. We're an LGBTQ arts collective based here in Washington, D.C. And our current project is called Black in Space, and we're celebrating and amplifying the stories and art of Black, queer, and trans folks. And the reason I bring that up is when I was invited to be on this panel, I really had to like take a moment and start really thinking about like my Duke experience and like what that meant to me, because it was definitely like a mixed bag, right? But when I started looking at it inside the classroom and outside the classroom, I realized like I had some of the most transformative experiences at Duke. And so, you know, I'm definitely big on gratitude. And so I did want to shout out a few people, because without three specific professors, I don't even think I'd be doing the work that I'm doing today in terms of celebrating Black, queer, and trans folks. And so the first one is Professor Richard J. Powell. He did this class called The Blues Aesthetic. I even found the little binder for it. And that was the class that showed me the possibility of Black art. And just like, he played Prince the first day, and I was like, oh, this is where I need to be. And so I appreciate him for that possibility and making me interested in art. The second person is Professor Bruce Payne, who was in the public policy department. I had the opportunity to go to New York and be in the leadership in the arts program, run around New York for a semester, go to plays, operas, museums. And it was in that moment I knew that I was going to have a career in the arts. And so thank you to Bruce Payne for that. And then the last person I want to thank, and it's probably the most impactful conversation, was Professor Paula Giddings. And I took a class with her called Writing, Race, and Gender. And at that point, I'd already come out, but I was struggling with my identity. Like, could I be Black? Could I? And at that point, I was identified as a lesbian. Like, what did that mean? And, you know, at one point, and my name was Elisa at that point, she was like, Elisa, you're both. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And she was like, you are both at the same time. And it, like, just that simple conversation, that affirmation, that permission, like, changed my life and just opened up so many things for me. And so I really have to thank those three people for inspiring me in my work today. And then also, you know, at Duke, I was really searching for a community, and Duke is where I started throwing parties. And so, which is what I do now, in addition to other dope spaces. But so all of those things started at Duke. And so I got there in, you know, 1996 as Elisa Lynette Perine. I'm now re-engaging with the university as Levingston Perine. And so for me, I'm really interested in what does it mean for like queer and trans alums, and especially trans alums, how do we re-engage with the university like safely and feel supported? And similar to Mikael, what are we doing to support current students? You know, I didn't come out until trans until I was 30, in my 30s, you know, and I have a very supportive family, right? But what's happening to our students freshman and sophomore year when they're coming home and telling their families that they're on their gender journey, right? And what are we doing to support those students? And so that's kind of where I am on this, but really excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Lee. And you know, this idea that faculty connections really matter, I'm taking that, you know, into my heart, like in terms of kind of my own value system and making sure that I'm like chasing them down every day. But this question of how we are supporting, you know, current undergraduates, I just think it's super crucial. And again, because I'm here on the ground, as it were, you know, I'm meeting an awful lot of queer students of color, like just many, many, many. So, you know, we were always here, but we're not necessarily always able to be near each other or recognize each other. So this question of like safety and feeling supported when you come back to Duke, in COVID, this has been a real super concern and challenge. And I know no one has any kind of quick answers. And right now there are no parties either. Like your field isn't something that we're able to do in the same way. We're doing it in other kinds of ways. But what have you found is a way for, especially for our trans kin of color, to approach family and friends in terms of how we're finding sort of best practices or healthy ways to re-engage community? Like, what can you just give us an example of what that looks like?
Well, can you repeat it one more time just so I make sure I'm answering properly? Like
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm asking. Sorry, Lee. I'm asking like, so what are some best practices in terms of how we re-engage, like how we find our way back into community as we are trans and finding our identities and sort of approaching each other with ourselves as they need to be. So how do we do that?
How do we do that? I mean, I think it's creating spaces and relying on allies to support those spaces that feel safe so that we can come into them. You know, to give an example, when it was time for reunion, so technically I'm class of 99, but I'm class of 2000, right? And so when it was time for reunion, my former roommate, Lauren Rice, was on the committee, and she was like, well, Lee, I'm gonna make sure that your badges are correct and everything is the way that you want it to be, right? And so like doing that work for me and like shepherding me into that process so that I felt safe and that I didn't have to take on that labor. She had done that for me. And so like sometimes like the less of the work having to be on like trans folks in those spaces and for allies to step up so that we can just show up as ourselves in those spaces. So I hope that answered it. But.
No, of course it does. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Lee. And it's a great sort of segue towards Bill Sermons, who I think has some comments for us in terms of allyship.
Hey, yeah, excellent segue. I was thinking as Lee was talking, and it's interesting listening to my other panelists and actually listening to Sanders' message at the beginning. It was just sort of like an affirmation out, the extent to which just being identified as straight and cisgendered is just a privilege. Being able to be identified that way and not face discrimination in and of itself, just that existence. And I think the reminder of that and the reminder of how much of that experience was different for my colleagues, fellow alums, is just really humbling. And that term humbling, is really, something I thought about a lot when I thought about comments here. And it sort of brought me back to this chapter. I'd read this book, Ethical Ambition by Derek Bell, who was the first tenured, Black law professor at Harvard Law. And at the end of that book, chapter on humility, he says, the admissions of past error and present inadequacy make it possible to accept the well-intentioned praise of those wishing to commend our efforts to serve others. They offer a value beyond commendation. It is reassurance. But there is a balm for its pain in the recognition and encouragement from neutral observers who, we must assume, have seen the big picture, have weighed our good intentions against any evils we unleashed, and found us, there is not a better word, worthy. And I think it's been a journey to sort of feel worthy of that word ally, but also to recognize, how much more work there is to do. Because I thought in that passage, the word good intentions countered against past errors and present inadequacy really does, sort of accurately characterize my own sort of personal relationship with being an ally. And, I see this invitation to be on this panel and the honor to be a part of it as really an invitation to myself to really be more intentional about that allyship. My own path, after leaving Duke, I was an engineer at Duke. I went on to become an engineering professor, and at some point recognized that, that work didn't give me enough of an opportunity for the kind of self-reflection that I think was more endemic as to who I wanted to be as a person, and became a social worker. And it was really as a part of that journey that I really, sort of identified with this need to be a better ally. And, to really think about the ideas of practicing, cultural humility, and really thinking about that sort of lifelong journey towards trying to really learn and understand and examine my own beliefs and re-examine my own beliefs and evolve. And, I'm definitely indebted to, people like Tim M. West, who, he and I have become very close friends after college, and my own journey, and having that privilege of being able for him to help me with my own growth, and for that friendship to be a catalyst for that growth has been, pretty a gift for me. So I'll close out there.
Thank you so much for that, Bill. I was thinking, so much of your remarks were about service and, humility, and it's something that we talk about a lot in the Black Queer course, because there are students who don't identify as Black or present as Black. And it's like, this question about listening and leaning in and learning alongside, thinking alongside others. And, it is part of the Black Lives Matter moment, is that we've got to figure out how to care differently and to listen carefully. So I'm not sure how to turn this quite into a question, but you going from engineering into, something like a social work, as someone who works in sociology, if you will, how did that transition happen for you? And how did you realize this kind of space of support and humility as a way to kind of live your life, essentially?
Yeah, no, that's that's an excellent question. Wasn't sure you were going there with it, but what comes to mind about that is just as I talked about, I think that I've thought a lot about sort of how people relate to Duke as an alma mater, And I think there's often this expectation of linearity that, you know, you majored in this thing and you left and you did this other thing that exactly followed on from that thing, and you sort of went on, you know, went down that path. And I think that, as Satana said earlier, you know, that you're so busy sort of doing that, that oftentimes you don't have the time to reflect on, you know, who you are as a person. And I think once I was out there practicing and being involved in projects where, you know, I was sort of on the fringe of the human sides of those projects, what I found was I need to be in the middle of the, you know, the human side of that. And, you know, that was really what that transition towards work looked like. And it really did open me up to sort of growing in different ways than I ever imagined back, you know, in '92 when I graduated with an engineering degree.
Thank you for that. And this question of the expectations for the university, I think our next panelist, Tim M. West, who we've already met, but I think Tim M. will have some things to say around that, or maybe not. We can get there in a moment. Thanks, Bill. So we're gonna move back to Tim M. West, if we can. Where are you here?
Here.
Oh, there you are. Thank you. Welcome back again. Thank you.
Sure. Well, goodness, where to start? You know, Bill, thank you for joining us. You know, it's interesting. I love the quote that you read because when I think about, you know, I'm sort of prompted to think about personal relationships and how they sort of form and shape not only who, you know, we think a lot about who we will become as professionals when you go to Duke, but like who do we become as people, as refined human beings. And I remember specifically getting an email from Bill some years after we both graduated. He was 2 years ahead of me, and what he probably didn't say was in that email was an apology. You know, there were things said to or about or around me when I was in undergrad because people didn't understand, or like Sanders said, like I'd never had an interaction with the person from that community. And we know when we haven't had interactions with people from the LGBT community, what we know is, you know, 3 snaps up, or, you know, whatever versions of LGBTQ we get. And what I know is that in the late 80s and early 90s, there were no positive representations of Black LGBT folk. And so coming out at that time meant sort of coming out into a storm. I mentioned earlier walking around the Bryan Center a few times before going to a screening of Marlon Riggs' Tongues Untied, where I got to meet one of my heroes, unfortunately before he passed away. But, you know, it's interesting because I walked around the building that many times, not because I was afraid to go in the room, but specifically I was scoping out to see if there were Black students around who would see me go into that space. And then the irony of that was, you know, many times I think my first DGLA meeting or going to that screening, going into a space where I was one of few Black people and feeling alienated there as well. So imagine circling around a building to find a safe space and then walking in and seeing no reflection of yourself in that space either. And white LGBT people who were very comfortable talking about LGBTQ issues, but not very comfortable talking about race issues. And so it's constantly this sort of balance. And one can step into courage and bravery. I'm Brave Educator on Instagram and Twitter, and that's who I show up as. But I think every bit of bravery is a response to deep fear and anxiety, deep uncertainty that you will be accepted. And I think it's Black people in general. You know, I was raised in a community where you were told when no one else had your back, when the white world did not accept you, that you could rely on the Black community and Black support and Black family. So imagine coming into a community like Duke and being fearful that the one small marginal community that you have for support will turn their backs on you because you do show up in a different way. I think that's very different. And when I went to Howard, we were all Black. And so I had a great gay time at Howard because you could find other queer Black students. And it was, you know, it was like, that was just one of the groups. There was not this pressure that I think exists at Duke and a lot of PWIs for people to conform, right? You had to kind of like, you know, you're already in a marginal, so you don't want to do anything that's going to make you stand out when you're already in the margins. And so, yeah, I think it's important that Bill offered that apology. And I'd forgotten all the details of anything that was said or done, but I think, particularly as a Black man on that campus, and we were the smaller number of Black students. And so there was even more pressure around sort of masculinity culture, fraternity culture, and certainly a lot of hurt and harm trying to fit into spaces. I came from the Upward Bound program where my mentors were Kappas and Alphas and Qs. And so I expected to be a part of the Black fraternity system, and was denied a few times that opportunity. And there's a lot of hurt around that. So I think, Bill reaching out to me, first I was like, oh, well, yeah, shoot, that's cool. Like, it's like years later, I don't care. But I think the more powerful and poignant part of the journey is actually forming a relationship and a friendship. I joke with him. I was like, he's probably one of a few Dukies that will, if I ever do finally get married and find somebody, that he has to be in the wedding. And I can't imagine having been able to say that, knowing who he was and how he showed up as an undergrad. I just like to mention that. And I think it was important for me that we have people on the panel that can speak to that evolution. We meet people where we are. We have to be humble enough to apologize for our missteps. I've not had conversations with some of my classmates who said harmful things or did harmful things. But some of them in small ways, through looks at me, through hugs at reunions or homecomings, have said, thank you. Thank you for, busting the closet door open and showing us how to embrace one of our own. And a lot of them have taken that into their own personal lives, and they carry that into their workplaces to really be what means to be inclusive. And I'll close by saying, I kind of have wouldn't call it superiority complex, right? But I do think that given the struggle that Black people have had in America, I want us to show up as the most inclusive, right? I get more upset when Black spaces are not inclusive, because I feel like the onus is on us to show up as empathetic as anyone, as gracious as anyone, as inclusive and welcoming as anyone. And so that's the charge, I think, for DBA, is to create an environment and a space where we feel, exemplary in terms of our inclusion.
That's terrific. Thank you, Tim. And, I do think that you hit on a couple themes that we'll want to return to: change through time and evolution of ideas and relationships, and also our own growth. And that's something that's also come through the panel as well. But also this idea that you just offered about how are we showing up in the world among each other and for other folks? And, what does inclusiveness look like for DBA or for us? And how are we making space for younger folks who are joining in, who are essentially students now, of course. I wonder if you could say just a little bit more about this hypervisibility, because it seems to be super important to how you're telling us about what it was like for you working in these two particular kinds of identity spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was a desire to, an awareness that there were more people like me, right? People can't find themselves who don't see themselves. And I have to give a shout out to someone who's no longer with us, Dr. Ed Hill, who worked in the Mary Lou Williams Center for years, and in his own small way, who affirmed me. This was the place where the B.S.E meetings happened. This was the place where so many Black things, the Modern Black Mass Choir used to, I know it's changed names now, dating myself, used to meet and have our rehearsals there. And I'm sure there were a lot of people there that didn't know his full story, right? Because we sometimes show up like a little bit muted, and we all fear, no matter where we stand, that rejection and fearing, like, what if people know, and then how will they treat us? So I think in some way the hypervisibility, what for me was important. And I didn't want for another student to go to a gay meeting at Duke who was Black and only see white folk. I thought it was important that people saw that intersection between those two identities. And if we look at historically, it's, Bayard Rustin was architect of the March on Washington. I didn't know that in college. I didn't learn that until after Duke. You know, and all the other things I learned that James Baldwin was queer at Duke. And that's a fact that may have saved my life as a high school student that was on the brink of suicide. So a lot to learn, and I think visibility is really important.
Thank you so much, Timon. And it's a wonderful segue to our final panelist for this session, who is Resilience Williamson, class of 21. So let me see if I can find you here. Oop, where'd you go? There you are. Okay. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Resilience Williamson. My pronouns are they, them, and I identify as non-binary. I am a senior currently at Duke, majoring in cultural anthropology. And I'm a Rubenstein Scholar at Duke, and that's Duke's first generation scholarship. I'll be like its second graduating class. And like tonight, I guess I want to talk about how my name, pronoun, gender identity, and even my Blackness has evolved during my time at Duke. I think when I came into Duke as a Black queer student, I honestly felt like I was sliding between being shoved in a closet, trapped in the corset of the pressures of being femme, as well as being scared straight almost by the fear or the odds that I'd end up in a casket before graduation, because there's a lot of coverage more recently about violence against Black people, but the violence against Black queer people, especially Black trans people, is often like escaped under the rug, and people don't want to talk about in our community because it's just too complex for us to handle at every stage of the conversation. So I felt like I was constantly pushed to choose parts of myself or leave pieces of myself at the CSGD or at the Mary Lou or in the SOGs. And I feel like I always had this pressure to keep chasing this ghost of who people wanted me to be or what was approved on campus. And I felt like another way of being first generation is that I was always working, always trying to get a paycheck, always trying to find some way to pay my bills and also support my family. So I couldn't necessarily keep up with the funds of the larger rich Duke culture, as well as keep up with the pressures and the stamina of the Black pop out culture, because we deserve to be great and be fabulous, but I can't spend my final paycheck this month on a dress to go to the sorority ball or go to the alpha party and things like that. And I feel like a lot of those spaces where Black friendship and connection was the most obvious, but I feel like being someone that was navigating the pressures of being femme in those spaces, it was harder for me to keep up financially, mentally, especially as my name and my pronouns and my gender identity was evolving. And I feel a lot of people in my early years at Duke didn't have space for that. And I feel like before the pandemic, I feel like being part of B.S.E, which is a Black Student Alliance, people were making more efforts to recognize Black queer people and the queer experience at Duke, but I feel like a lot of that allyship was performative. And I feel like it didn't go beyond putting their pronouns in Zoom or putting their pronouns in the group chat, but recognizing that even if you don't see Black queer people or know Black queer people, our experience is just as valid as yours. Our Blackness is not any less because we are queer or who we love or who we are attracted to. And I think that sometimes the arguments that people make about racism against Black people is sometimes some of the arguments that people make to justify homophobia against other Black people. And I think that as some of the other panelists have touched on, I think learning to be empathetic and trying to be more inclusive is something that the Black community has to work on to an extent, but also sometimes as a queer Black person, I don't have to be empathetic to everyone. It's not my job to always let people know what it means to be Black and queer. I am the most vocal Black queer person on campus in my year, but I don't want to have to explain to everyone what it means to be Black and queer at every single hour of the day. Google is free. It's an awesome resource. It answers a lot of the questions. It does miss some of the key points and the complexities, but you have to be able to take people with what they're willing to share and offer. People are not there for your curiosity. Not everybody's identity needs to be interrogated to correct or right some type of ignorance that you're coming into a conversation with. And I feel like during my time at Duke, I felt like I was constantly trapped in this trench of mental health struggles from always being anxious about who I had to impress and please. And I think a lot of people talk about mental health struggles in the queer community as a lot of people I know are passively suicidal or navigating their own negative thoughts. But I feel like for me, as Black, queer, and first generation, the question was never to be or not to be, but it's who did I need to be to get through this week, through this day, through this class, through this hour, through this meeting. And oftentimes it was the cheerleader or the clown who was naive to what was going on, but I had to act like I was okay. I had a fake smile for most meetings I had to go through because I needed these meetings to get the visibility and the respect and the bullet points on my resume. And I think that people overlook those pressures for Black queer people, especially people who are non-binary and trans, because Duke and bureaucratic universities really hide behind legal names and sex assigned at birth for liability reasons, but they're ignoring students' livelihood and what we need to make it through our day. And I feel like the pandemic has made what it means to show up a lot different. And I think that for me, when the pandemic first started, Duke allowed a lot of queer students and Black low-income students to stay on campus because they were concerned for our mental health for legal reasons. But I think that that genuine concern has not been consistent, and it hasn't been as cultivated as they portray in the media. And I think that what people need to design to be is to not make mass solutions without talking to students at different levels in this population. Because I feel like whenever you make a solution that's supposed to be for every Duke student, sometimes you have to recognize that some students are being scapegoated. Some people are being sacrificed, and you have to really be able to stand 10 toes down on who are you okay with sacrificing. And if that's your Black, queer, low-income students, I think you have to dig deeper. The solution isn't solving anything if you're making a different problem for an already marginalized and objectified population amidst not only a viral pandemic, but a racial pandemic. And I think that universities and the culture on campus and allyship has evolved a little bit, but I think it has to be richer than just pronoun coverage and balances and things like that on panelists. It has to be ingrained in how professors address students beyond just his and her or ladies and gentlemen. I think there's a lot of Southern hospitality ingrained in Duke's culture that is very gendered. And being a person of the South, I understand how intoxicating it is, but it's hard to unshake, especially in Zoom where I have to constantly correct people. In classes, it's hard to correct people when you're taught to be grateful for the respect and opportunity to be in this space. And I feel like overall that I ran out of time in college to keep chasing that ghost. And I feel like it's my last semester at Duke, and I feel like there's a lot that I need to do. But I found people to support me through my legal name change and to keep motivating me when things got hard. And I feel like I tapped into Duke's awesome access to humanities research to discover what Black queer possibilities look like when I couldn't find any. And I think that not every queer student is that lucky. Not everyone has that same access to be able to dive deeper and to look harder. And I think that universities have to find that space to help Black queer students see themselves their freshman year, their O week, before they even become students, not just when they're about to graduate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, yes and yes. There's a lot to be done. And I am curious about student input into systems at Duke and how you're experiencing it. It'll be something we can thread back to Tim M's work and also Denzell's presentation. Just, so how students are having input into higher level conversations around who gets to stay on campus or who lives where, or could there be different sorts of affinity groups or spaces available? What is your experience? I mean, it doesn't need to be your job as an undergraduate to know how to answer these questions. At the same time, by now, as a second semester, senior, you must have some other ideas on what you think could be mobilized, especially for non-binary Black queer students.
I think a lot of students have been mobilizing in the pandemic in the sense of creating spaces for town halls, even virtually. A lot of people that do have the privilege to have access to administration are trying to cultivate programs over a long term, or they're getting access to the vice provost and these key administrative figures that can make change. A lot of Black people I know before the pandemic, they spent weeks trying to revive the Black living space. And even in the pandemic, it's still happening, but in a different way people anticipated. And I think that before this school year began, there was a big push to raise tuition on the Duke end, but a lot of students got on social media, started compelling their peers and striking. And I think that what students can do, we raise a big roar on social media, and then our Austin alumni come in calling and complaining to Duke, and Duke listens to alumni. What students do, we provoke outrage and we let alumni know what's happening behind these semi-closed doors or these smoke screens that Duke likes to put up to keep its image. And I think that the alumni, they come when we need them. I feel like the problem is that the people that have the access to the space to make those kind of waves, they're not always the people that need it right away. Like first geners, we can't always, come for our own aid, because if our scholarship is funded by a prominent alumni that is supporting the policies that we're protesting against, we can't sacrifice our scholarship because we need college, we need access to this money to survive. So I think that we just have to figure out how to increase the impact that student voices can have. But I think that collaborating more with alumni and alumni reaching out to more student voices to see how can I make my vote, my donations that do count, who do I need to talk to, how can I connect you and help you like start combating this problem today, not 10 years from now. I think that's what a lot of students have been tapping into during the pandemic.
Terrific. Thank you so much. We have time now to open back out towards a larger panel, and we have some questions in the Q&A, and we want to encourage people who are tuned in to our broadcast to submit questions as you have them. There's a couple that are already there. I see that, Tim M., you're going to take on this question from Larry Johnson. The question is, was there a movement to award Duke degrees to the men expelled in the 1960s? Or actually it says there was a movement. What happened with that? And Tim M., I think you have an answer for us.
Actually, I do not. I was curious to know the answer to that, because I do think that some repair is needed for that. So I'm curious to know, I think maybe like many others, has the university done anything to redress those men and grant their diplomas?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question. Denzell, do you have an answer on that at all? Or anybody else?
I do. I can jump in here.
Beautiful.
So there was a lot of debate about this at the time, and the students, that was actually one of the 11 demands we made, was that the university grant all 64 of these individuals honorary degrees. The issue came because some people felt that, some people both in the administration and some people in the community felt that it might cause more harm than good to go back to people now 50, 60 years later, who might not be out, or contacting people's families who might not still be alive. And so that was the reason why that project kind of was put on pause. But I do agree that something should be done, if it's not particularly for those individuals, but just a commemoration for, all 64 of them as a collective.
You pointed towards something that I think we could hear from a couple panelists about, which is, who's out or not out, or who's willing to actually, or able, willing is a funny word, but who's able to actually participate in a Black queer community, because we all might understand that we're all not able to participate, at all, or at least even symmetrically. And I remember going to Lavender graduation here at Duke, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago. And I think I was a replacement last minute speaker because I was the speaker. But as I recall, I got asked like 3 days before, which is fine. And I really enjoyed the event. But there were a lot of signs like, if you don't want your image taken at this event, just let us know. And this is 2017, 2018. So could we hear from a couple people about this sense of possibility of being out on campus as undergraduates or graduate affiliates with Duke?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that because I think I also served the role not only as someone who was visible and courageously stepping out, but of protecting classmates and friends of mine who did not feel comfortable doing so. And it was largely believed that the cost of coming out, if you wanted a relationship with the Black community, if you wanted to pledge a Black fraternity or a Black sorority, if you wanted to be involved in the Black faith community, that those would sort of like not be possibilities for you if you came out. And so there were those of us that knew about people, but we kind of protected those people. And then I've met countless Black alum from Duke who would say, thank you for the work that you're doing, but I don't bring that part of myself when I go back to Duke. And I felt like that was sad and unfortunate. And I wanted to have this conversation because I don't want that to be the case. I want those alumni to feel like they can come back to Duke and that they're going to find welcome and acceptance by their peers.
Yeah, and I think that feeling also probably never goes away for people. I've been out my entire adult life. I have a position of leadership and authority in my community, and I will still hesitate sometimes to be in queer spaces as a Black woman. And so it's really interesting to think about Tim M walking around the Bryant Center over and over, just in case somebody saw you go in. I mean, all of us have had that experience. And one of the things I would say to undergraduates is, one, you do grow up. And at some point, what the cost of staying in is higher than the cost of being out. And you know, you're not at least for me, I'm gonna speak for me, I could, you know, cannot live your authentic life without letting people know who you are, you know, especially the people who love you. Lee Levingston talked about having a supportive family. I have a family that's super supportive. And it was still challenging to come out for them. It's challenging to stay out with them. And yeah, and so this idea, I'm also in a Black sorority. Shout out to my sorors of Delta Sigma Theta out there. And you know, like Tim said, there's a lot of pressure. I know now that there were a lot of queer women in the sorority with me, right? Not people that I heard about later, you know, like, so it's also interesting over time to see who comes out and how they manage that, you know, like Tim says, coming back. And for the first time, coming back is your true authentic self. Sometimes, you know, I think most of the time what people say is they say, you're the only person who didn't know you were queer. The rest of us.
Yeah, that is a classic. Thank you, Krista. And it connects to a couple of comments that have come up in the Q&A. One is reminding us of a Washington Post article today that's running a statistic that 1 in 6 adults identify as LGBT in some way. And, you know, they're asking questions around, is that true for us? And it's like, well, of course it's true for us. We are people. So yes, we are identifying maybe 1 in 6 adults as LGBT with a subset of bisexual. You know, so this is going to be true across identity politics of the undergraduates and graduate students. But there's another question around the most homophobic campuses that maybe we could take on a little bit. For anyone who was on campus in the 90s or the early aughts, this sort of designation of Duke as one of the most homophobic campuses, does that seem fair? I wonder how, Lee, how you're hearing that. Is that making sense to you?
Yeah, so I don't know if Duke was the most homophobic, maybe it was, but when I moved to DC in 2002 and finally found my tribe of like Black queeros and weirdos, like they had similar experiences on their campuses. And so the stories they told weren't any different than the stories I was telling. So for me, I don't have this feeling of like Duke was the worst place or the most homophobic, because all the folks I was connecting with, we were just happy to find each other and have people to, in some ways, like heal and connect with, because we didn't have that experience in undergrad.
Yeah, does someone else want to come in on that? Like, yeah, is that resonates at all for you? Let's see, who else might want to take that on? Oh, Tim, nope. I was thinking about it in relationship to when I came here as a faculty member, and you know, I came from the Northeast corridor, and I guess I was pretty surprised that it was like this. I mean, we didn't have Bill 1, we had the bathroom bill within my first few years of being here, and you know, I thought, wow, this is the crazy bit of the 21st century South that my colleagues and family said, you know, be careful down there because it's really different than what you're used to up here in the Northeast after living in California and Indiana, the Midwest. So it is something that I heard Resilience talking about, like a gentleness or a certain sort of Southern sort of manner that makes our Black queerness maybe have to figure itself out in different kinds of ways. So Resilience, I don't know that you have anything to compare it to necessarily, but do you think it's one of the more homophobic spaces in terms of your experience as an undergrad?
Can you repeat the first part of your question? Like,
sorry, is it one of the more homophobic? I don't know that there's something to compare it to necessarily, but you know, when people are saying it's one of the most homophobic spaces, does that resonate for you now in the, you know, the 2020s?
I feel like sometimes like the culture of Duke tends to be more homophobic because it's just so heteronormative. I think the way Duke is structured, there has to be a men and women's everything. There has to be a balance. It's focused on that, like it's very binary. And I think the way that that comes up is that Duke wants to be the speaking of the South, but it doesn't really have like it can't really tap into its true Southern roots without tackling its anti-Blackness. So the Southern hospitality is very performative. So they don't know how to expand their language to be inclusive. So I feel like when you're just confronted by it, it is very jarring and very homophobic, and more so than like the local public universities where the culture is kind of more of a melting pot almost because there's people from different angles of this community and they have more direct roots to the area they're around. Like most people in my class at Duke are not actually from Durham, and how they see termites and the larger like area around Duke is very much from an elitist standpoint. And I think that's why it just continues to like compound because their southernness is a performance and inherently more gendered than it tends to be.
Right. That's the anti-Blackness of the term Durhamites to begin with. We could talk about that's a whole nother thing there, which the problematics of using that terminology to describe local people from Durham. But I will say that I think some of it's like the proof is in the policy, right? And I think that there were other universities who were making strides in different areas. I mean, certainly the gender neutral, was it restrooms and Duke taking a stance on that was certainly progressive. Someone brought up the admissions. I worked in admissions for a few years, and certainly now there's a question on the application that invites students to talk about their sexual orientation and gender identity as part of their application. But I mean, there's still another piece of that I think is worth mentioning. In particular, at Black Duke, to go to Duke is a real privilege, and there is deep respectability politics that comes with that, right? And I think that some of the homophobia and heteronormativity is around this idea that like, well, why would you do damage to yourself professionally by owning this other identity? Right? It's not even that like the Black community we're really good at don't ask, don't tell. We did don't ask, don't tell before the military, right? We do it in Black churches, we do it in Black choirs, we do it in Black sports. This idea that like, oh, we know that happens, but we just don't talk about it. And so I think that part of it means like, what does it mean to create a culture at Duke among Black folk where visibility and openness is actually where people don't see that, if you come out in undergrad, that your professional options are going to be limited, which is why I think it's so powerful that we have people like Lee, starting initiatives that are national, and Satana, who is leading in the legal field. It's important for undergraduates, to see Denzell, who I know just finished his law degree as well, right? We are all commiserate professionals in our fields, and we are Black and LGBT. And I think our undergrads need to see that, because I was told, if you come out, that's going to hurt your chances professionally. That's going to limit your possibilities professionally. And I think that's part of a respectability narrative that needs to be challenged.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that actually had come up before in terms of this idea that, only holding one identity at a time, or this sort of respectability politics that surrounds what it is to be a Black person on the campus of Duke. I wonder if Mikael, you could come in here a little bit and give us a way to think about how you felt respectability politics were really sort of directing your experience while you were an undergrad here as you were finding your way towards your destiny, basically.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of respectability politics, I think that was more so in terms of choice of major. I think I was kind of funneled into or pressured into like pursuing engineering, as it was seen as something that was more professionally viable. And I said I wanted to major in biochemistry, and that was not seen as being as viable as biomedical engineering. And so I think it was more so from that perspective. I feel like in terms of this conversation here, I think that one of the challenges was that, and I mean, probably still today, is that the LGBT organizations at Duke that were available to me as a student were white-led and were majority white students. And so even when I was trying to necessarily kind of find spaces of connection and belonging, right, those spaces did not reflect my own experience. And so I think that's one important part to also think about in the conversation, is just, you know, what are the levers that we can pull in the spaces that we really build for specifically focusing around that intersection of the Black and LGBT experience.
That's really helpful and super true. What we keep hearing as a theme throughout this is a need for abundance. I mean, we need more possibilities for undergrads while they're here at Duke. We certainly need more faculty, so I won't be so lonely, although I have a few colleagues on staff or here on faculty who are also generally identifying as Black queer people and are out and available to the student body. I mean, I'm someone who always reads as queer. It doesn't seem to matter what I do. And that's something that I really love and cherish. So I feel very fortunate and grateful in that personally, but that just really isn't true for everyone. And we wanna also make space for people to shift identity and shift their preferences in terms of pronouns or how they're addressed. And, you know, a practice I have is to always ask people, how shall I address you? And it's not, how should I call you? Or how do you want to be called? Like, you know, those sort of coercive language, but what shall it be? And it, you know, it really is pretty much day to day, because we do understand that even our presentation around sexuality or orientation shifts. And maybe that's something that was in the Washington Post article today that was mentioned in the Q&A. I'm trying to see if there's any other questions we need to contend with, but I think I can also turn us back to our welcomers here, to the folks who are going to take us towards our next event, our next part of it. Is that you, Sanders, or?
Good evening, you guys. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Thank you all for your authenticity. Thank you for your truth and your sharing. I will now turn it over to the co-chair of Duke Black Alumni, Dina Simpson, to close this out. But I will say, this will be sort of one of many conversations we want to have around these topics and other topics. You know, this is a complicated and quite frankly, an emotional issue for all of us, no matter where you find yourself in your own identity. We want to keep having these conversations. And we welcome all ideas from all the alumni out there. And I will now turn over to Dina. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Sanders. And on behalf of D.B.A. and the LGBTQ plus networks, I just want to say thank you very much to Professor DeFrance serving as our moderator tonight and really asking some very thoughtful questions. And of course, to all of our panelists who took the time this evening to speak to us. They all did so. They spoke their truth and were very candid. It was a very humbling conversation. So we do appreciate that. And of course, we want to thank all of the individuals who joined us tonight. We can't have the event without you. So thank you for joining us and Zooming in and submitting your questions so that we could have this type of dialogue this evening. Hopefully you all will be encouraged to live your authentic and true selves every day, like our panelists and speakers tonight. And just, you know, as a community, I hope that from this conversation, we'll all kind of be more affirming and celebrating our brothers and sisters in the LGBTQ plus group. So thank you again. Like Sanders said, hopefully this is one of many conversations. I saw the chat blowing up. Everyone had a lot to say on this topic. And so hopefully this is not going to be the first and last, but one of many. So thank you all for joining and have a great night.